The world watched as two of the most powerful men on the planet sat face to face in Alaska, but when the cameras turned off, the bombs in Ukraine never did. Diplomacy has always carried with it a certain weight, not only in the agreements it produces, but also in the silences it leaves behind. When world leaders gather in closed rooms, what emerges is often less important than what does not. The tone, the omissions, the words left unspoken, all of these reveal just as much as a signed treaty or an official statement. The Alaska summit between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin is a perfect reflection of this paradox. In the days leading up to the meeting, speculation centered on whether a ceasefire in Ukraine would be declared, whether the suffering of millions would finally be addressed. Yet, when the doors opened and the leaders stepped forward, that single, most pressing question remained unanswered. It is in this silence that the true story lies. A hook in global politics is rarely found in polished speeches. It is discovered in what leaders carefully avoid. For Trump, the summit was framed as a success, filled with optimism, handshakes, and carefully chosen words about progress. For Putin, it was an opportunity to project strength, to claim there was an understanding without defining its terms. Both men spoke at length, but neither uttered the decisive commitment the world was listening for, an immediate ceasefire. The absence of that word did not come by accident. It was deliberate, calculated, and heavy with meaning. When diplomacy falls short of action, silence becomes its own message. The silence after the Alaska talk signals that neither side was ready to shift ground. Trump, eager to portray himself as a dealmaker, chose to emphasize potential rather than results. Putin, equally intent on preserving his strategic leverage, offered only vague reassurances. What remains unsaid, then, becomes the loudest echo of the summit. The suffering in Ukraine, the urgency of halting attacks, the desperation of civilians, these were not addressed with concrete solutions. Instead, the silence on these issues spoke volumes. The hook of this moment lies in the contrast between expectation and reality. A summit promoted as a step toward peace concluded without even a pause in the violence. The power of what was left unsaid reveals the fragile state of diplomacy in this conflict. It reminds us that words of progress without action are as hollow as the silence that follows them. The Alaska summit between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin was highly anticipated, with expectations running high that it might deliver at least the first step toward halting the bloodshed in Ukraine. For weeks, speculation had built around the possibility of a ceasefire announcement, a symbolic gesture that could mark a turning point in the war. Yet when the talks ended, there was no such breakthrough. The outcome was clear and sobering. No ceasefire, no binding commitment, no immediate relief for the people enduring the conflict. Instead, the summit concluded with carefully chosen words of optimism, but without the decisive action that the world was waiting for. This absence of agreement underscored the gap between the spectacle of diplomacy and the substance of meaningful progress. Trump described the talks as extremely productive and painted them as a step toward peace, but this description could not disguise the fact that nothing tangible was secured. The phrase sounded reassuring, but without a concrete plan to pause the fighting, it was more performance than policy. Putin, on the other hand, emerged from the summit with his own narrative, suggesting there was some form of mutual understanding while offering no real concession. Both leaders left the stage with statements that were deliberately ambiguous, designed to give the impression of forward movement while avoiding the responsibility of immediate action. For Ukraine and its allies, the absence of a ceasefire was a devastating reminder that peace remains distant. Soldiers remain on the front lines, civilians continue to flee their homes, and cities remain vulnerable to bombardments. Each passing day without a ceasefire is a day of lost lives, broken families, and deepening humanitarian crises. The Alaska summit, instead of marking the beginning of relief, became another moment of deferred hope, where political calculation outweighed urgent necessity. The failure to secure even a temporary halt to hostilities reflects not just the entrenched positions of Russia and Ukraine, but also the limits of Trump's influence in negotiations. By declaring progress without evidence of change, he positioned the summit as a success for optics rather than for outcomes. The reality is that the meeting ended where it began, with the war continuing and peace no closer than before. Vladimir Putin's remarks following the Alaska summit were carefully crafted to suggest that progress had been made without offering any real substance. He spoke of understanding and hinted at a constructive exchange with Donald Trump. But when it came to specifics, there was nothing concrete. No timelines were set, no commitments were announced, and no steps toward halting the violence in Ukraine were outlined. The vagueness of his language was deliberate. By keeping his words broad and undefined, Putin maintained flexibility, avoiding promises that could limit his options while still projecting the image of a leader open to dialogue. This approach allowed him to walk away from the summit with the narrative that he was cooperative, yet uncompromised. The absence of concessions was particularly telling. For months, international observers speculated whether Moscow would signal any willingness to reduce its military operations in exchange for diplomatic recognition of its concerns. Instead, Putin held his ground. He reiterated that Russia's security demands, such as curbing Ukraine's alignment with Western institutions, must be respected. By not giving up anything tangible at the summit, he preserved his bargaining power, ensuring that future negotiations would begin from a position of strength. His refusal to acknowledge the immediate humanitarian crisis created by the war only reinforced the impression that Russia's priorities remain geopolitical rather than humanitarian. For Trump, Putin's posture presented both an opportunity and a challenge. The American president could highlight the cordial tone and claim that dialogue itself was progress, but without any evidence of movement from Russia, the claims rang hollow. Putin's unwillingness to provide measurable concessions made it clear that he did not attend the summit to compromise, but rather to test the waters, gauge Trump's approach, and demonstrate to his own domestic audience that Russia would not be pressured into submission. The result was a performance of diplomacy rather than its practice. Putin's words gave just enough for Trump to portray the summit as a success, while ensuring that Russia had not sacrificed anything in return. The strategy was calculated: maintain a cooperative facade while continuing military operations unchanged. By choosing ambiguity over clarity, Putin ensured that he could control the interpretation of the summit's outcome, leaving room for Russia to act as it pleased while avoiding direct accountability. For the failure to achieve a ceasefire, Donald Trump's framing of the Alaska summit as extremely productive captured headlines, but the phrase quickly revealed itself to be more about presentation than policy. His choice of words created the impression that progress had been achieved, even though no concrete agreement emerged from the hours of discussion with Vladimir Putin. This kind of framing is not accidental. Trump has long relied on bold declarations and optimistic soundbites to control the narrative, ensuring that the public sees him as a decisive leader and skilled negotiator, even when tangible results are lacking. By emphasizing productivity rather than outcomes, he shaped the story of the summit to reflect his political strengths while sidestepping the reality that the war in Ukraine remains as violent and unresolved as before. The emphasis on productivity was also strategic because it allowed Trump to maintain momentum for future negotiations without admitting failure in the present. Calling the talks unproductive would have signaled weakness or an inability to sway Putin, which would have undermined his image both domestically and internationally. By instead describing the meeting in glowing terms, he left the door open for further summits and gave his supporters a reason to believe that progress was being made behind the scenes, even if no immediate evidence was offered. This tactic buys him time and positions him as a leader keeping the diplomatic process alive, despite the lack of breakthroughs. However, the gap between the rhetoric and the reality cannot be overlooked. While Trump praised the talks, the facts on the ground in Ukraine did not change. The shelling continued, the civilian toll mounted, and the absence of a ceasefire meant that the conflict carried on without interruption. For Ukrainians, the claim of productivity rang hollow, a reminder that political spin often overshadows their suffering. For America's allies, it raised questions about whether Washington is prioritizing real solutions or simply the appearance of progress. Trump's framing also reflects a broader trend in modern diplomacy, where perception often matters as much as reality. Leaders increasingly rely on the language of success to sustain their influence, even when the outcomes are thin. In this case, the phrase "extremely productive" acted as a shield against criticism, deflecting attention from the lack of concrete steps and instead focusing on the promise of what might come next. It turned a summit without results into a story of potential, even if that potential remains unfulfilled. The absence of a ceasefire at the Alaska summit, it was more than just a diplomatic disappointment. It was a stark reminder of the ongoing human cost of the war in Ukraine. Each day without a pause in the fighting means more lives lost, more homes destroyed, and more families forced to flee in search of safety. The world had looked to this meeting as a chance, however slim, for relief from the relentless violence. But when the leaders emerged without even a temporary halt to hostilities, it underscored just how entrenched the conflict remains. For those on the front lines, the lack of progress was not an abstract political outcome, but a continuation of their daily suffering. Soldiers remain under constant fire, civilians endure bombardments, and children grow up in an atmosphere of fear and displacement. The missed opportunity resonates most painfully in the lives of ordinary Ukrainians. Cities that might have enjoyed even a brief reprieve from shelling will instead continue to endure destruction. Hospitals that might have had time to regroup and treat the wounded without interruption remain under threat. Humanitarian organizations, which often rely on ceasefires to deliver aid, remain hampered by the danger of active combat zones. Every day that passes without an agreement to halt the violence deepens the humanitarian crisis and chips away at the possibility of rebuilding communities once the war does eventually end. On the diplomatic stage, the absence of a ceasefire revealed the limits of rhetoric when not backed by tangible action. Leaders may speak of progress, of understanding, of hope for peace, but without a concrete step such as halting military operations, these words carry little weight. The world is reminded that diplomacy is not measured by how meetings are described, but by the changes they create in reality. In this case, the failure to secure a ceasefire highlights the chasm between political theater and the lived experience of those trapped in war. The consequences of such a mischance extend beyond Ukraine. Internationally, the perception grows that global powers are either unwilling or unable to force meaningful concessions from Russia. This undermines confidence in the effectiveness of diplomacy and raises doubts about whether any future summit it will deliver more than symbolic gestures. Without immediate steps to halt the violence, the war continues unchecked, and the promise of peace remains overshadowed by the harsh truth of continuing destruction. During the Alaska summit, Donald Trump chose to shift the responsibility for peace onto the shoulders of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, a move that carried significant political implications. By declaring that it was now up to Zelensky to get a deal done, Trump effectively recast the United States' role from active broker to supportive bystander. This framing allowed him to present himself as a facilitator of dialogue while avoiding direct accountability for the absence of a ceasefire. It was a carefully chosen strategy, one that redirected attention away from what had not been achieved at the summit and placed the burden on Ukraine to take the next decisive step. For Ukraine, however, this repositioning is deeply complicated. Zelensky has long made clear that any peace process must respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, yet the suggestion that the outcome now depends solely on his willingness to compromise places him in a vulnerable position. By pushing the responsibility onto Kiev, Trump increases the pressure on Zelensky to appear flexible, while Moscow continues to demand concessions that strike at the core of Ukraine's independence. This dynamic risks creating a perception that if peace is not achieved quickly, it will be Ukraine, rather than Russia, that is blamed for prolonging the war. From Russia's perspective, this framing is advantageous. Putin can continue military operations while waiting to see whether Western leaders pressure Zelensky into making concessions. If Ukraine resists, Moscow can portray Kiev as unwilling to negotiate. If Ukraine concedes, Russia gains strategic ground without needing to retreat from its aggressive posture. Either way, the burden-shifting strategy weakens Ukraine's diplomatic leverage and strengthens Russia's position at the negotiation table. For Trump, the move also served domestic purposes. By presenting Ukraine as the central decision-maker, he distanced himself from responsibility for the lack of progress, ensuring he could still claim the summit as productive. He preserved his image as a deal-maker while leaving the outcome in the hands of others. Yet the reality is that this narrative risks isolating Ukraine at a critical moment, leaving its leadership caught between defending sovereignty and facing growing external pressure to compromise. The suggestion that peace is primarily Ukraine's responsibility ignores the reality that Russia holds the power to end its aggression immediately, but chooses not to. The Alaska summit it became a textbook example of how symbolism can overshadow substance in international diplomacy. From the dramatic setting in America's northern frontier to the carefully staged images of two powerful leaders seated side by side, every detail was designed to project an air of history in making. The optics were grand, the tone was carefully managed, and the statements afterward were polished to suggest progress. Yet behind the scenes, there was little to show for all the spectacle. No ceasefire was agreed upon, no roadmap for peace was laid out, and no measurable steps were taken to alleviate the suffering in Ukraine. What the world witnessed was not the forging of solutions, but the performance of statesmanship, where the appearance of dialogue became more important than the reality of outcomes. For Donald Trump, the symbolism was essential. By highlighting the cordial atmosphere and describing the talks as extremely productive, he could position himself as a central figure in the pursuit of peace, even without delivering results. His political strength has often rested on controlling narratives, and the summit allowed him to claim victory in the realm of perception. The handshake, the smiles, and the rhetoric of respect all fed into a story he could take back to his supporters, that he alone was capable of engaging world leaders at the highest level. The absence of substance became secondary to the carefully crafted image of diplomacy in motion. For Vladimir Putin, the symbolism carried its own rewards. Appearing on equal footing with a U.S. president in a high-profile summit reinforced his stature as a global power player. Even without making concessions, he left the stage projecting strength and legitimacy, secure in the knowledge that Russia's position had not been weakened by the talks. The spectacle itself served his interests, demonstrating to his domestic audience and to skeptical international observers that Moscow remained a central actor in shaping the future of Ukraine. The gap between symbolism and substance left a deep impression on the global stage. While images of the summit were circulated widely, analysts quickly noted the lack of concrete progress. The pageantry may have provided political cover for both leaders, but it did little to change the reality on the ground. For those enduring the war, the carefully staged optics offered no comfort, only a reminder that the machinery of diplomacy can sometimes value performance over the hard work of delivering peace. Global consequences of the Alaska its outcomes stretch far beyond the meeting room where Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin exchanged words. For Ukraine, the immediate reality is the continuation of war with no pause in sight. Soldiers remain entrenched on the front lines, forced to endure ceaseless bombardments, while civilians navigate a daily existence marked by fear, displacement, and uncertainty. Without a ceasefire, there is no window of relief for humanitarian agencies to deliver aid safely, no chance for communities to rebuild even temporarily, and no reprieve from the constant shadow of violence. Each day of delay translates into more casualties, more trauma, and more destruction of infrastructure critical to Ukraine's survival. The absence of progress at the summit makes clear that Ukraine's suffering remains caught in the gears of global politics. For the United States, the consequences are measured in perception as much as policy. The summit raised questions about Washington's role in the conflict, whether it is acting as a determined mediator with the leverage to influence outcomes or as a bystander content with appearances of diplomacy. By framing the summit as productive without delivering substance, Trump invited scrutiny over whether America is prioritizing meaningful change or symbolic gestures. To allies in Europe, the lack of a ceasefire signals uncertainty about U.S. commitment and consistency in supporting Ukraine, sowing doubts at a time when unity is critical. These doubts, if left unchecked, could fracture the collective resolve that has so far been central to Ukraine's resistance. For the wider world, the implications are sobering. The failure to secure even a temporary halt to the war underscores how elusive peace remains and how fragile the international system can be when confronted with entrenched conflict. Global audiences watching the summit saw leaders exchange pleasantries while lives continue to be lost, reinforcing the perception that diplomacy often moves at a pace detached from the urgency of human suffering. The symbolism of dialogue without results risks eroding trust in international institutions and the power of negotiation itself. The Alaska talks highlight the uncomfortable truth that while summits can create dramatic headlines and political theater, they cannot guarantee progress unless leaders are willing to make real concessions. For now, the world is left with a war that grinds on, and a peace that still feels as distant as ever. The Alaska summit, it will be remembered less for achievements and more for the void it left behind. A meeting heavy with expectation that concluded without delivering what the world most desperately awaited. The absence of a ceasefire transformed the summit from a potential turning point into yet another moment of deferred hope, highlighting the distance between grand diplomatic gestures and meaningful results. The war in Ukraine continues unabated, and the symbolic weight of the summit now lies in what was left undone. For Ukrainians on the ground, the lack of progress was not a matter of political analysis, but of immediate consequence. Families remain displaced, soldiers remain in peril, and civilians continue to live under the threat of bombardments. Every day without agreement compounds the sense of abandonment for those whose futures depend on decisions made far from the battlefield. The legacy of this summit is tied to silence and absence. Trump's declaration of productivity, Putin's vague references to understanding, and the staged optics of handshakes could not conceal the reality that no document was signed, no ceasefire was announced, and no timeline was set. The void left in place of these actions becomes the defining feature of the meeting. It is this failure to bridge words with deeds that will shape how history views the event. Rather than serving as a breakthrough, it risks being remembered as a symbol of paralysis in the face of crisis. The international response mirrors this sense of unfinished business. Allies and analysts note that the pageantry of the summit offered cover for both leaders, but left the core issue unresolved. Instead of clarity, the world was left with ambiguity. Instead of a halt to fighting, the war continues with the same ferocity. The sum, its lack of tangible outcomes, has the potential to weaken faith in diplomacy, reinforcing the perception that high-level meetings often prioritize performance over solutions. In the end, the Alaska summit underscores a painful truth about modern conflict resolution. The gap between hope and outcome can be vast, and the cost of failure is borne most heavily by those with the least power to influence events. What lingers is not a sense of accomplishment, but the stark recognition that peace remains elusive, and that the promise of dialogue has once again outpaced the delivery of results. The Alaska summit promised progress but delivered only promises. Without a ceasefire, Ukraine remains engulfed in war, and the world is reminded that peace is not achieved through handshakes and headlines, but through actions still waiting to be taken.